Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, Botswana's Secret Migration, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Russell Gerber. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Over to you, Russell.
Thank you so much, Rob. Really appreciate it. And thank you for that kind introduction. And welcome to everyone joining me all over the country and all over the world. It's my pleasure to be back again, talking about, again, another one of my favorite destinations. You might have seen a bit of a pattern, often chatting about Botswana. And today, no different. Something that is something I've managed to see and enjoy a few times already, and it never fails to amaze, and it's such a special experience. And today, of course, we're chatting about Botswana's secret migration. I'm coming to you live all the way from Cape Town, and looking forward to a great chat today. So as I mentioned, today we're talking about Botswana's so-called secret migration. Not so secret anymore after today, I imagine, but let's dive right in. So firstly, of course, who am I? And that is a picture of me from recent safari in my new cowboy hat as a gift from some of my guests, which was a lot of fun. I've been a safari guide for many years now. I actually started guiding in 2004. But before that, actually kicked off my love for nature and working in the wild as a student in undergraduate. And I did a degree in zoology and African vertebrate biology. I then did a postgraduate honors degree in marine biology, a little bit different, but I always had a passion for the marine world and always felt that would be the area most suited to me. And that's really what I followed through on, which was great. But when I finished, I decided to take a little break from the marine world and work as a safari guide. The plan was just to do it for a year or two as a gap year, as many of us call it down here in South Africa and in the UK. But in the end, I just enjoyed guiding so much and working in the field that it just stuck. And I've been working one way or another in the field as a guide, both a marine and safari guide, all over the world since 2004. But I've been back guiding in the bush here in Africa for the last 8 or 9 years. I've been guiding with natural habitats, of course, since 2018, which has been a great pleasure. Over the last couple of years, where we've all been kept away from the outdoors more than I would like, I've actually been working as a wildlife presenter at africam.com, which has been a lot of fun, and checking out the live cameras out in the bush, basically hosting virtual safaris. So that's just a little bit about myself, and I hope that I get to meet some of you one day on a natural habitat trip somewhere here in Africa. But enough about me. Today, we of course are talking about these wonderful animals, the zebra, and this particular migration today is all about the zebra itself. And there are, of course, other species which we'll get into, but the outline that we'll be looking at for the day is firstly, what is migration? We'll go into some details about where this migration takes place, which is, of course, in Botswana. We will then go into where do the animals actually go? Where do the zebra go? And what are their movements during this migration? We'll touch on a little bit of why they go and what the purpose is for them moving these long distances around the country and even into Namibia. Why is it secret? As I said, not so much anymore, but we will touch on what the reasoning for that is. And then we'll also go into why it's such a special experience and what makes it so unique. And lastly, of course, I will touch on a couple of ways and explain a couple of ways that you can come and experience it for yourself. It really is a magical thing, and if I can convince even one of you to come out and experience it, I promise you will not be disappointed. So that's it. That's the outline for our little chat today. And without further ado, let's begin. So first and foremost, as I said, we'll talk a little bit about what migrations are. And of course, they are spectacular natural phenomena which used to happen all over the world. Um, in many instances, they are still occurring, and they are generally considered to be large movements of animals over generally large distances, and almost always driven by changing weather conditions, and often for the purposes of feeding. Moving from one feeding ground to another. Now, most people would understand that and would be a fairly logical understanding of why the animals would move. And, especially in a continent like Africa, driven by drought and flood periods, the animals often do move. But what makes this so unique is what we're going to be touching on today. And there's just a number of reasons that makes this particular um, migration of the zebra around Botswana quite special and different from the others, which we'll go into in just a little while. One of the biggest reasons that we don't see these migrations as much anymore, as many of you would know, is many of the routes have been cut off. And because of that, few of the real migrations actually remain. The largest one, of course, is here in Africa, um, and that is the movement of mostly wildebeest and, of course, zebra in East Africa, the movement of the animals from the Maasai Mara into the Serengeti uh, and back again. And that, of course, is the most well-known, certainly most well-known migration here in Africa, and is by far the biggest number of animals that migrate here in Africa. So that one many of you would have heard of before, but I suspect many of you joining us today would not have heard of what this particular migration is all about, this movement of mostly zebra here in Botswana. So where is Botswana? Many of you would not have been down here before, and of course that is a map of Africa. Highlighted in the central part of the southern part of Africa is, of course, Botswana, a landlocked country surrounded by Namibia to the west, to South Africa to the south. We've got Zimbabwe to the east, and just to the north, of course, is Angola. So, sorry, Zambia, not Angola. Just the other side of that little strip above it is, in fact, Angola. But that's really the surrounding neighbors of Botswana. And of course, South Africa, where we are, is, of course, one of their neighboring countries. And this is just a little focus on Botswana itself. And we're going to go into part of this map for a significant portion of our chat today, discussing the route and discussing where these animals actually move around. But as you can see, Botswana itself, a very large country as well. You'll look in the northern parts of the country, you'll see that large area of water, which is, of course, the Okavango Delta. And then the darker green patches you can see are actually national parks, with the Central Kalahari National Park in the central parts of the country. Right down in the south west, we've got the Makgadikgadi Transfrontier Park, which actually continues into South Africa and Namibia. And then, of course, the Ngaipan and Makgadikgadi Pans National Parks, which we'll be focusing on a lot today. And that is really just a little bit of a breakdown of where Botswana is and what the country looks like as a whole. You'll see right down in the southeast is Gaborone, the capital, and then Maun, just to the south of the Okavango Delta, which is often considered the gateway to the wild areas of Botswana, particularly the areas we'll be talking about today. So there you go, a little overview of Botswana itself for those of you who didn't know where exactly it is. And it's a pretty small country, only just over about 2.2 million people in terms of population, but a very big country and very dry. In most cases, or in most parts, it is considered a semi-desert or certainly arid region, and relies heavily on water sources coming from a long, long way away, up in the highlands of Angola, for one, where the water slowly makes its way down into the delta and into the rest of Botswana from other water systems. So a very dry country on the whole, but with those systems which I've chatted about in the past, and if you're interested in the Okavango delta system, it supports a huge amount of animals, and that water drives very much the system of migration that we'll be talking about today as well. So who is that? That is, of course, is zebra, and in particular, it is a Burchell zebra. It used to be called Burchell zebra, today known as plains zebra. And in Botswana, the animal movements have long been spoken about, and people have known that they've occurred, and that the wildlife tends to move along the major river systems, depending on the season, of course. But as the dry season comes, many of the animals will concentrate towards the permanent water sources, particularly your big megafauna like zebra, wildebeest, buffalo, and elephant. But the large numbers of these animals, as I said, tend to spend majority of their time by the river systems. If you go up into the northern parts of Botswana, around the Chobe River system and down towards the Linyanti, and then, of course, the permanent river systems, which is in the Okavango River itself, that is where you'll find most of the animals most of the year round. So when you travel through to Botswana, often those are the areas you would concentrate on for a safari, and you'll find that majority of the time that is where the animals spend most of their life. And because of that, they don't need to rely too much on the change of weather systems for water source. It is a really, really important part of their survival in the Delta and in the Botswana region, simply because, as I mentioned, Botswana is such a dry country, and they always struggle with water, as for all species throughout the year.
Russell.
In many cases, though, they actually, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to let you know
Are we struggling?
we are experiencing about a 2-minute delay between the slideshow changes. So I just wanted to let you and all of our viewers know that that's what's happening, and I apologize that we can't get that fixed at the moment.
Okay, how would you like me to proceed then? Do you want me to keep going?
Absolutely. Let's keep going. I just would like everyone to keep that in mind, that there's just a slight delay due to the technology and you being halfway around the world.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Rob. I'll do my best then. I'll try to slow things down, but yeah, essentially, you'll be able to follow the majority of it as I go through. But yeah, if it does get worse, please do just let me know, and then we can perhaps try again another time. But yeah, let's get back to where we were. And as I said, the zebras move, and many of the animals in Botswana, as I was discussing, actually move from these wetter areas into the Kalahari region, which is essentially a dry region, the more arid part of Botswana, in the wetter months. During the dry months, they tend to stick around those water sources as the only real source of water for them during that time of the year. Kalahari sand, interestingly, actually does retain water pretty well. Again, I did a chat on the Kalahari that you can check out on the Daily Dose of Nature as well. And the sand does hold water pretty well. So even if you go to the Kalahari and Makgadikgadi pans in the dry season, you don't have to dig too far down to actually find water below the surface, even though it looks absolutely bone dry. So yeah, just an interesting system that we're looking at in terms of this whole region, all the way from Chobe in the north down through the Okavango, and of course down towards the Kalahari region that we will be focusing on a lot today. So today we'll actually be focusing on two zebra migrations. Essentially, they move at the same time, but they tend to move in slightly different directions. Now, what's interesting about all of this is that it's actually only been fairly recently discovered that this has been going on. And in the early 2010s, it was first identified that this little understood migration of plains zebra migrating from the northern parts of Botswana and the very edge of Namibia all the way down towards Ngaipan actually was happening on a yearly basis. And since then has been recognized as the longest wildlife migration in Africa of roughly around about 300 miles in distance, which is really impressive. So even longer in distance than that of the East African Serengeti wildebeest migration, often referred to as the Great Migration. But researchers also then released some detail on another separate zebra migration to the Makgadikgadi pans. Now, those are two difficult words for you to say, so if you take some time to practice, but again, those are two regions that we'll be focusing on today. It was really this migration between the northern parts of Botswana towards Chobe and Ngaipan, and then, of course, Makgadikgadi region and the Okavango Delta, that these zebra migrations were first noted to be taking place. As I said, very much towards the end of the 2000s up until the beginning of the 2010s, when this first started to really be identified as happening. And what is quite interesting about it is that many of the researchers have suggested that it may represent an ancient route that the zebra actually are remembering and instinctively following to different regions of Botswana, rather than a response to particular environmental conditions. Now, that has been difficult to follow in terms of how they would know that, and of course, it's very subjective and scientifically very difficult to prove. But we'll get to that a little later of why that was first suggested. But the other main reason, of course, is that it is also suggested that the grass available and feeding available around the pans at that time of year is more nutritious than the grasses available in the Chobe and Okavango regions. But again, we'll come back to that a little later on. So this might be a little difficult. Well, we've got a significant lag for some reason, but I'll do my best and hopefully you'll be able to follow it fairly clearly. But if you look at the top of the screen on our first slide of the map, you'll see that this particular movement of zebra is around the January to March time of year. So what we'll be looking at in terms of their movement is when we'll start at the beginning of the year, which is often referred to as the end of the rainy season from January to March, and then move through the rest of the year. But as you can see, in the beginning of January and March, the zebra tend to be hanging around the Makgadikgadi pans right in the south. Just to the north of them, you'll find another large group of zebra in the Ngaipan National Park and surrounds, and then also a permanent population that tends to hang around the Okavango Delta, which is just above Maun in this diagram. So what happens then from January to March is the zebra start making a move to the northwest from the Makgadikgadi pans, and then from Ngaipan, they start moving slowly north. And those are the two major movements that we start seeing from around the end of January into February and then March. So bearing in mind now this is the end of the rainy season, things are starting to dry up. We're starting to see a little bit of overgrazing in these regions, and the zebra have now started moving away from the pan systems. So on our next slide, you will see from March to May, and bringing them back in again, the zebra moving from Ngaipan have now moved just into the southern part of the Chobe National Park. Our group of zebra that have been hanging around the Okavango Delta are still there. They're not really moving off too much because it's often, almost always there is some water available, particularly in the permanent water channels. So those zebra tend to stay put. But lastly, our zebra from the Makgadikgadi pans have slowly started moving northwest and are now just on the southern tips of the Okavango Delta by around about May. So as it stands, that's where we would see the majority of our zebra in this region at this time of year. And then you can see they're still continuing their march from Makgadikgadi pans into the Okavango Delta, and our Ngaipan zebra still continuing their march and migration up towards the Chobe River. Then from around about June through to November, the majority of our zebra have now established themselves around the permanent water systems. Now, June to November tends to be renowned as the driest time of year for the Okavango, and of course, sorry, not for the Okavango, for Botswana as a whole. The Okavango starts to receive water around about this time of year from the flooding that comes into that system, which again attracts the zebra from the pans coming into the area to pick up whatever new grazing they might be able to in what is generally a very dry time of year. Our zebra that have moved from Ngaipan have now gone up towards the Chobe River, again, another permanent water system where they can enjoy grazing and, of course, permanent water from the river all year round. So that's why we're seeing a movement into different areas, both of which are driven by permanent water systems. The fourth little zebra diagram coming in here around the Chobe region just goes to show you that the zebra in that area actually form a huge, huge group, and it's spread out along that river system all along the Chobe from, as I say, around about June all the way through to November. Then lastly, we have our zebra all hanging out in the Okavango. We've got our zebra up hanging around in Chobe and the water system up there, and the Linyanti system also just below the Chobe system. So all of that now inundated with zebra from December to January. But as we start getting into the season, we get the rainfall starting to arrive. And generally in December, we start to get some heavy rain. And by January, we are well into the rainy season. And this then starts the slow movement of the zebra back towards the south. Now, interestingly, just so you know where we stand, the movement to the north and to the northwest that we've seen earlier in the year is actually quite slow. They don't tend to go too quickly, and they'll actually move over sometimes in 3, 4, 5 weeks. It will take them to get to these different locations. When we get to the December, January time of year, when the rains start to fall in Ngaipan and they start to fall in the Makgadikgadi pans, there's actually a far more direct movement of the zebra back to these regions. And honestly, it can take sometimes as little as 2 weeks for them to make the trip all the way down back to these pan systems. So around about January, we'll start to see the actual movement of zebra from the Maremi area, the Okavango Delta, down towards the Makgadikgadi pans southwest. And then we've got the zebras arriving in the pans around about January, like I said, pretty quick. Then from the Chobe region, heading south directly into Ngaipan, and then a group of them also that heads a little bit southeast, and they actually stop over at a small lake system before then making their way down to join the rest of their friends in Ngaipan by about mid-January. And that tends to be the pattern that we see for the zebra themselves and the cycle that they will follow. So pretty much starting in the south at the beginning of the year, which is the rainy season, as things start to dry up, they then move north and end up in the Maremi, and then of course up into the Chobe regions by about mid-year, and then by the end of the year, the driest time of the year, in around about October, November, they will be up in the Chobe system and up in the Okavango systems to get as much water and feeding done as possible around that time of year. So that is the cycle. And once again, we get them heading down again. And we've now been noting that, and scientists have been noting that since around about 2012. So as I say, a very recent discovery in terms of their actual movement. Even though it was always thought that they were moving around like this, it wasn't until fairly recently that it's been scientifically proven and recorded. So again, to me, just a really, really interesting system. So now the question is, why do they go, and why is it a secret? Well, as I said to you already, it's not so much of a secret anymore, but why do they go is very interesting, and the history behind it is quite important. Botswana itself is a country reliant on mining and agriculture. It is the major driving force in their economy, and it wasn't until recently, until around about the turn of the 2000s, perhaps the late 90s, that we started to see a real turnaround in terms of tourism gaining traction in Botswana as an economic source of income and GDP. So when that started to happen in the early 2000s, it was considered that perhaps we need to start focusing on tourism as a potential source of income. Before that, Botswana had a veterinary fence put in, basically separating the Okavango Delta system, the Savuti, Cylinder, and then, of course, up towards the Chobe systems. There was a huge fence that separated, basically, or split the country from north to south, or from the north to the south, and between them, basically split what was mostly cattle in the south with the wilder animals in the north. And they didn't think too much about this. Essentially, they were trying to do a good thing to avoid foot and mouth spreading between the animals, the domestic animals and the wild animals. And that was the initial idea. What they didn't quite realize, of course, is that the animals were moving up and down between the systems. And as we just noted, you had animals that were coming down all the way from the far reaches of the north down into the southern regions, and eventually couldn't get through because of a fence line. But what did happen is that a number of wildebeest that were at the south below that fence line when it was built, they couldn't get back to the north when they needed to get back to those permanent water systems. And over the period of about 5 years, the majority of wildebeest in the northern Botswana, were lost because of that. They simply couldn't get to water, and many of them didn't survive. And it is quite well documented that around 150 years ago, the migration of wildebeest and zebra to the north and south along these same corridors that we've been talking about were absolutely a rival to the Great Migration of East Africa, and some people suggest it may have been an even bigger number of animals moving between the two regions. But because of this fence line, many of those wildebeest were in fact lost. And the zebra at the time, many of them were up in the north. They couldn't then come south, but because there were still the permanent water sources of the Okavango and Chobe, a number of those did indeed survive. And it's why in this particular instance, we have the vast number of migrating animals in this migration being zebra and not wildebeest. So why did it start around that time again? Why did we start seeing the movement of zebra or only start studying it scientifically from the end of the 2000s? Well, the fence was actually only removed in the early 2000s. And this was again to emphasize their newfound interest in growing their tourism industry in Botswana, and removing that fence line was considered quite important to improve and increase as much protected area for wild animals as possible. So when that happened, what was very interesting to note is, and what we do need to bear in mind, is that the zebra lifespan in the wild is only about 12 years. And many scientists and conservationists couldn't figure out how on earth they would know to start moving back down south again when the fence was removed. And how did they start migrating? And certainly in the beginning, it wasn't at the numbers we're seeing today. It was only a few that started moving, and generally driven by the fall of rains in the pans themselves. So again, sensory systems picking up rain hundreds of miles away to then drive them to start moving south was really quite remarkable. And to me, makes for one of the most special new systems and animal behaviors that we've noted in modern time in Africa, certainly in Southern Africa. And for those main reasons, I would think that's why it is generally considered quite secret and fairly unknown to many people and conservationists, certainly on the scale that we tend to see the safari region. And the migration itself. Again, people don't tend to realize the numbers that we're talking about. In many cases, we're looking at about 30,000 animals moving at any given time, which is really impressive, for an area like Botswana, which is mostly desert in many cases. Further studies have actually shown that most of the zebras are migrating to the south because the grasses have a higher nutrition content, and content of protein and minerals than the Okavango and Chobe areas. So that would also make sense as to why they would start moving. But what they don't seem to understand at the moment is also the fact that only about 55% of the zebras are migrating for the time being, with around 45% actually staying in the Okavango region and about 30% staying in the Chobe area. So what they have noted, though, over the last 10 years or so, is that that number is steadily growing, and that a higher and higher percentage of the animals are actually moving every year, which is quite remarkable and really exciting as this whole system grows. And what we've also noted is that we're starting to see more and more blue wildebeest joining this slow migration as well, which again is very exciting as things change. And one of the things that may also be driving it is that many conservationists will tell you that the Makgadikgadi salt pans themselves, one of the largest salt pan systems in the world, certainly the largest salt pans here in Africa, they're slowly shrinking, and the grassland region around the Makgadikgadi pans is actually growing, which again bodes well for the herbivores, but not so much for the enthusiasts who like spending time on the pans themselves. But we'll see what happens, but it looks like that system, the salt pans themselves, are actually slowly shrinking and the grasslands growing. So this is just a little excerpt and a photograph that I took in the Makgadikgadi pans, and this was in the wet season, and you can see there really is a lot of water around, a lot of grass on the ground as well, and this is the green season. So around about January, when I was on this trip, and you can see huge numbers of zebras around. Just about everywhere you look, there are zebra. And this was just one little waterhole, but I promise the nature of the Kalahari and Makgadikgadi area is that it's so flat, and you can just see for miles. The vistas are incredible, and the sheer number of zebra in the region is remarkable. As I say, at any given moment, you'll be looking at around 30,000 animals on the move, and with these wide open areas, not a hill and a mountain in sight, you can really get a feeling of the huge number of zebra and animals that are in the area in that time of year. And then we've gone through quite a few of the things that I think are quite special about the region, but let's focus a little bit more on why it is special. And as I say, this is very much my opinion, but to me, not only is it the longest large mammal migration in Africa, because of the reasons we just discussed, it's actually generally and widely unknown by tourists and by conservationists and visitors from around the world. And also, because the best time to really see this migration is generally around about the summer period, the wet period in Botswana. Many of the visitors to the region are not around at that time because it can get rainy and you can get caught in storms and things like that. But the truth is that is the best time to see the Delta, the migration itself, particularly in the Kalahari region. Also, as we chatted about a little earlier, it's been only relatively recently discovered in terms of real scientific research, and more is being done, and every indication is that this is going to become a migration to compete with the Great Migration of East Africa as time goes on, and if the good conservation work that Botswana government have been doing in the past, in the last 20 years or so, if that can continue, because the animals seem to be just going from strength to strength, and the numbers growing steadily every year. So it is a really exciting time for Botswana conservation. The other thing, of course, is that many other species have been identified as following similar migration routes, and the timings of the zebra themselves. As I mentioned, we of course had starting to see the wildebeest joining on these migrations in bigger and bigger numbers. And what we have also noted for quite some time is the movement of elephants up and down these corridors. For the most part, we tend to see the big elephant bulls making the largest migrations, but certainly in the wet season, when there is a lot of water around in the Makgadikgadi and Ngaipan area, we see a lot of herds of elephants coming down around that time of year to feed on the grass that is available. And as I said, very nutritious grass to be found in that region. And for the elephants who require a very large amount of food to survive every day, it is a really important area for them to come and spend some time in, particularly in Botswana with a population of elephants steadily growing these days. It's estimated around the 200,000 elephants in Botswana mark. Um, and the majority of them spend their time around the permanent water systems in the Chobe and Linyanti region. But thankfully, more and more of them are coming south to take advantage of those improved feeding grounds around the Makgadikgadi and Ngaipan area in the summer period. So always good to see. And yeah, around that time of year, great viewing of elephants in the Pan areas. Not as common to be seen in the area because of the sheer lack of trees in many instances is, of course, giraffe, but they do come down. You do see them in certain parts of the uh, of the Kalahari and the Makgadikgadi area, not so much towards the Pans, certainly, but on the edges where there is good um, browsing, you do see small groups of giraffe, but certainly as you move further north into the Okavango, Chobe, and Savuti Selinda areas, the population of giraffe in Botswana is amazing, and they certainly have been noted to be moving further north and south, though giraffe don't tend to have as many issues as the other animals because of their height. They don't have too much competition when it comes to eating the leaves that they require. So overgrazing is not something that they have to worry too much about, but still a species that you'll often see close by these migrations at any time of year. Another one, of course, that is pretty iconic and for most people very exciting, and if you give it some thought, you would realize pretty obvious would be following close behind these migrations is, of course, the predators. And the most well-known of them, certainly going down into the south and Makgadikgadi region, is lions. The lions are quite fond of zebra and wildebeest. It tends to be a fairly good size meal for them for an average pride of lions, size of a pride of around 10 to 15, which is pretty common in Botswana. A prey species like a zebra is just about the perfect size. It's not too risky, not too fast, but it does provide a really, really good meal for them. Now, of course, there are a lot of challenges involved in hunting, no matter what they're going for. But with those large numbers of big herbivores moving up and down this region of Botswana, of course, not far behind, you're going to have some predators, and your apex predators, like lions, are certainly going to be a part of that. And I've been fortunate to witness a number of hunts in these particular regions as the lions follow these massive herds, and particularly at certain times when the young foals of the zebra and even the youngsters from the wildebeest tend to start arriving. So those things all together, um, you know, make for pretty much a great system of these big animals, big herds moving from one place to another, and the sneaky predators following slowly behind. But again, another particularly good reason to come and visit. This one was also taken in the Kalahari itself, very near to Ngaipan, and this is a young sub-adult male lion. And again, just really good numbers of predators in the region, particularly around the green season when there are a lot of zebra around the Pan systems. Another one particularly adapted to drier regions and occurring all the way through Botswana, all the way up into the north and wet regions as well, is of course cheetah. And again, following the youngsters particularly, it is a very, very good time for them to start hunting in the wet season. And you'll often see that happening as the zebras arrive in the Makgadikgadi. You have these predators almost ready and waiting. Many of them have young cubs at that time, anticipating a time of plenty for them as the other young babies arrive of the herbivores, and then feeding on those they give their chances or give the best chances to their young to actually make it to adulthood. So, not as commonly seen in terms of predators as the lions, but certainly cheetah is something that I've seen many times in this region, and yeah, seeing them alongside all those zebras is something to behold. Another thing, that you might see there, though not migratory, there are a number of beautiful and iconic species in the Kalahari. This is a meerkat, of course, and one of the greatest attractions to coming down to the Kalahari, not just, of course, to see these zebras, and with them a number of other species like brown hyena and other desert-adapted animals, particularly the nocturnals, like aardvark, and even pangolin in some areas. But then if you take it all the way up to the north, in the Chobe region, as I mentioned, you've got incredible numbers of elephant in the northern parts of this migratory route. Um, Along that river, you also get huge herds of buffalo, um, Cape buffalo, which is always incredible to see along the Chobe. And then, of course, the Okavango itself, which is just an absolute wildlife Eden, all of these encompassing this migratory route that we're talking about. So, pretty much any time of year is a good time to see it. But in terms of numbers of the zebras themselves and a concentration of all these animals together, I would certainly recommend going to the Makgadikgadi pans and Ngaipan areas in the summer season to get your best view of all these big herds. And that, of course, brings us to how do you experience it? What is the best way to do it? How do you get there? And all those good things. And where should you go? Should you go to Chobe? Should you go to the Okavango? Or should you go to the Makgadikgadi? And to be honest with you, all of them are very, very special. I have done a chat on the Okavango and, of course, on the Kalahari. The Chobe region is just as special for the reasons that I just mentioned. But you get to do wonderful river experiences in Chobe where you can actually do game viewing from the boat in some instances. You can also do that in the Linyanti region, just to the south of Chobe. The Okavango, of course, well renowned as a world-class wildlife area. And then Makgadikgadi just has these unique desert adapted animals and, of course, remarkable landscapes all around. But in terms of actual viewing of the migration, simply because of the landscape and also because the numbers of them and access to them, I would say Makgadikgadi and the Ngaipan region are going to be your best bet for seeing this zebra migration in full force. And of course, the best time to do that would be around about January, February, or March, when you will start seeing the zebras start moving away from the area. But if you arrive early enough in the year, as I said, around about January, you'll actually you will catch many of them still hanging out around the waterholes in the Makgadikgadi system. So that would certainly be my recommendation of where and when to go to see this secret migration. Some of the NatHab trips that we have that you can sign up for, that you could perhaps be lucky enough to come and actually witness this, is the Kalahari, the Delta and Beyond safari that we have on offer. There's also the Botswana Explorer, which takes you into some of these regions, and then Epic Botswana and Namibia as well, which you could consider as a potential option. So all of which will give you a taste of many of these areas. But as I say, if you can time it so that you are in the Makgadikgadi or Ngaipan region around about December, January, or February, that's going to be your best viewing of the secret migration of Botswana. And folks, that brings me unfortunately to the end of my little presentation for you today. I'm sorry we've had a little bit of technical issues and a little bit of a delay. So I hope that it's still been manageable for you guys to keep up with where we are. I know it might look a little confusing, but I'm very happy to answer some of your questions to clarify anything that you might have on your mind. But thank you very much. You got anything for me, Rob?
Thank you, Russell. Yes, I do. But before we start the question and answer session, I'd like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. All right, let's get to some of these excellent questions. Can you talk more about the pan system? What exactly are the pan systems? And do the zebras move south to the pans because the pans become more lake-like? Can you just explain what they are for us a little bit more?
Absolutely, yeah. So as I mentioned, I did do a little couple of chats on the Kalahari where we do go into the Makgadikgadi pans themselves here on the Daily Dose of Nature, so you can find that as well. But what is very special about it is they are salt pans. So they were actually part of a Great Lake system that formed over thousands of years as a huge river system, essentially part of the Zambezi, used to flow into that region. And then with some tectonic movement, we actually saw eventually that river system changing its course and moving into where it is flowing today, basically across the northern parts of Botswana, and it cut off that flow down into the south. And with that, left this huge area that started to dry up, and then actually became more and more salty as time went on, and left this thin, salty crust, creating what is known as a salt pan. And essentially, what happens there is the soil, as I've mentioned, actually holds water quite well. When it does rain, that salt is quite nutritious in certain parts, certainly where it gets diluted enough, and that helps for in the rainy season for us to actually get really good grass systems growing there. That tends to drive the big herbivores a little further south to the edges of the pan, but certainly not further into the actual salty, crusty part of the pan where really there's nothing going on. So as I said, it's a bit of a the chicken and the egg story. Where did the zebra start? But essentially, in terms of an annual year, in the wet season, the rainy season for Botswana, which tends to be, as I said, December through to, let's say, February, the most of the zebra will be around the south, around the Ngaipan and the Makgadikgadi pan areas. Then, as time goes on during the year and it gets drier and drier, these zebras start moving north, one group towards the Chobe region, and the other group northwest towards the Okavango system. And eventually, they will end up in that area for about 6 months until the rains start to come again. They can actually pick up the scent, we think, of the rain down in the south, and they'll start then moving back down to the southern pan regions out of those permanent river systems towards the wet season in December and January again. So I hope that answers the question, Rob.
Thank you, Russell. Um, how many different types of zebras are there? Um, are there different species?
Wow. Well, excuse me. There are actually quite a few. Um, but in terms of subspecies versus actual species, it's quite a contentious issue. Excuse me. In southern Africa, um, by far the most common zebra species we have is the plains zebra, or what used to be called the Burchell's zebra. But these days, we've got essentially two different zebras in southern Africa that we refer to as either the Cape Mountain zebra or the Hartmann's Mountain zebra. The rest will be considered at the moment subspecies, but in southern Africa, certainly that's it. As you go further north, you'll get more Grevy's zebra, which is pretty common for East Africa. But for the time being, as I say, in southern Africa, certainly we have two true species of zebra.
Thank you, thank you. Do you know why the zebra was never domesticated the way horses were, or are they?
They actually tried in some instances, certainly when colonizers started to come through to Africa they were considered really beautiful, and it was thought that perhaps they could be utilized as carriage horses. But it was essentially discovered that they were very difficult to domesticate. They were quite wild. They were quite prone to sickness and disease as well. And then lastly, their back is nowhere near as strong as a horse's back, and that they discovered quite early on that the power required to either pull a cart or certainly to ride them, they just simply didn't have the strength to handle that. So essentially, they gave up. There was some, you know, investigation into it, but eventually they gave up. So since then, I've never really seen or heard of domesticated zebra at all. What they did do is actually interbreed them with donkeys, um, and created hybrids essentially. But nothing in terms of zebra themselves um, being domesticated that I know of.
So are the wildebeest that were lost due to the fence recovering their numbers? Are they endangered?
Yeah. Yeah, they are recovering. They're not considered endangered. You know, they are all part of the same species of blue wildebeest or brindled gnu. But the numbers are steadily increasing. Every time I go to these regions in Botswana, I feel like the numbers have increased significantly. As I said, it seems that the grassland systems and savanna systems around Makgadikgadi are slowly growing as the pans shrink. So that again just provides more and more food sources for the increasing numbers of wildebeest. So that's why I say majority of researchers and conservationists are suggesting that this may soon, even in the next 10 or 20 years, start to compete with the migration in East Africa. Maybe to get to the sheer numbers of that area, probably another 50 years, maybe 100. But it's certainly possible if they can continue their good conservation work in Botswana.
Would you say that Botswana is the most progressive and proactive country on conservation and capitalizing on ecotourism?
That's debatable for sure, and a difficult question. They had a time and a president where he was really focused on wildlife, and many people criticized him for that too. That he did let some things slip in other sectors and social systems, but his focus on conservation certainly did make huge leaps and bounds for Botswana as a conservation destination. We started moving a number of rhinos that were hugely under threat in South Africa into Botswana because their anti-poaching systems were so robust. Um, and in many ways, for a while, they really were. And I would say for Southern Africa, certainly, and a lot of Africa, they really are doing incredible things, and are really have good focus on protecting their environment. I would say Rwanda has done remarkable things as well in recent times in their progressive nature towards conservation. And for South Africa, where I'm from, I think for the time being, we've been doing okay, but there is a lot of room for improvement for South Africa as well. So yeah, difficult question and very debatable, but I would say Botswana has certainly been seen as a conservation success story in the last 30 years or so, with some caveats here and there.
So if I were to come to the Botswana secluded safari in June or July, would I see a large concentration of animals still?
Absolutely, yes. You wouldn't see the big numbers of zebra altogether because they're spread out across the Okavango system and across the vast Chobe River system and national park systems. So you would absolutely still see great zebra and, of course, all the other animals in those regions around that time of year. And it is still the most popular time of year to go on safari because of those reasons. Your sheer diversity around your permanent water systems that time of year, and of course the flood waters arriving in the Okavango around that time of year, all make for some of the best game viewing in Africa. There's no question. The Makgadikgadi area, Ngaipan area in the winter months, still exceptional, in terms of what you can see there. Often still some elephants around, of course some lingering zebra, wildebeest, and other uh, desert adapted animals, as we've spoken about. Um, and not to mention the vistas, the stars, and just the amazing landscapes in Makgadikgadi region. Also, just incredible to watch. But yeah, that's the thing about safari. Any time of year can give you a lot of benefits. It just depends on what you'd like to focus on. And in this particular instance, for the migration and zebra, the without doubt, the best place to see them in big numbers all together is Makgadikgadi and Ngai in around about the January February time period.
Thank you, Russell. Unfortunately, that's the last question we have time for today. So I'd like to hand it back to you to see if you have any closing comments for us.
Thank you, Rob. Yeah, no, not too much from my side. Really, just a great pleasure chatting with you again. I'm sorry about the technical issues. I hope we managed to enjoy and put together some of the stuff that I was talking about. But yeah, always such a pleasure chatting with you all, and I hope with all my heart that you can come out and see this incredible migration at some point, and hopefully I'll see you out there in the field. But otherwise, that's it from me. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Russell, so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd like to also thank everyone who tuned in. Please join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on the website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar for today. Goodbye, everybody. We'll talk to you next time.